Welcome to the module on Administer Governance and Compliance. In this session, we will cover core architectural components of Azure, explore Azure policy initiatives, and learn how to secure your Azure resources with Role-Based Access Control, or RBAC. Additionally, we will delve into managing subscriptions and governance, configuring resource locks, applying and managing tags, managing resource groups, and configuring management groups. By the end of this module, you will have a comprehensive understanding of how to effectively manage and govern your Azure environment. Let's get started with the core architectural components of Azure. To understand Azure architecture, we'll go into Azure regions. Now, one of the first things that we want to understand is Azure is spread into multiple regions. There are more than 60 regions spread across 140 countries at the moment, and many more coming soon. Now, within each region, we have many availability zones and data centers that are available in that region. Now, let's have a quick look at understanding how these look like across the globe. To see this, let's go into a new tab. Let's open aka.ms/global infrastructure -infrastructure. Now, as soon as you land onto aka.ms/globe-infrastructure, you'll see some details around different regions that are available. But for this part of the session, let's have a look at exploring the global data centers. Now, as you can see, this animation over here shows you different data centers and regions that Azure has available for you to look at, and you can explore information around what regions you might want to choose. Now, the choice of region may vary based on your users and your needs that you might be implementing your solutions for. Certain regions have certain features available for them, but these features might not be available in all the regions. Also, when you're considering creating a region for your resources, you might want to bring them closer to your users. Let's, for example, pick up on one of the regions and explore some more details. For instance, let's hover on to one of the regions over here. So let's consider using UK West as one of the regions. Now, this tells me a brief introduction around where the region is and some information around in terms of some features that it has available for me to implement my solutions. Typically, within the region, you might have 1 or 3 different availability zones available for you to work with, a feature that we'll consider discussing a bit later in the course. Currently, if I look at UK West, and if I'm looking at availability, you can see currently this region only has 1 availability zone or 1 region and does not offer the 3 region availability in this particular region. So if I switch this along from UK West to UK South and explore some more options there, I can see there are 3 availability zones available for me to implement my solutions, if that was a feature that I was after. And then I can explore some other details around each region. Now, this gives you a good understanding of different regions that are spread across the globe and how you can utilize them in different parts of the world. Now, to understand this a little bit more, let's jump back onto the Learn portal for a minute. And in the Learn portal, we'll try Azure regions. And land onto the Azure region documentation. Now, part of the region documentation, if I look on the details, I can find the list of regions that are currently available for me. And if I scroll down, there's a long list of regions that are available. As you notice carefully, most of these regions will have a region pair available for them to look at. Now, these region pairs are very important, simply because they give you a higher availability for you to access your resources in case there was an outage. Now, these regions are typically kept 300 miles apart from your primary region, just to avoid any natural disasters. Now, you can explore a long list of regions from the documentation here to understand what regions might be suitable for you based on your users and where you want to implement your solutions. Let's jump back onto the slides for now. As mentioned, each region has a paired region, as you saw in the documentation. Now, there are various reasons for you to choose a region. For example, as I mentioned, you can choose a region based on where your users are to reduce latency. However, you could have other reasons for choosing a region. It could be based on data legislations or compliance standards that you might be looking into. For example, if you are creating resources or your solutions in a UK region, you might have different laws that you need to comply with to retain your solution or your data in that region and then work with it. Similarly, if I created a solution in UK region, that can ensure that it will comply with the local legislations. Now, apart from the data residency, you might need to look into if a region offers you availability options if you're looking for ensuring higher availability in a solution. Now, apart from regions, let's understand the structure of the resources that you might be creating in Azure. Now, to break down the Azure architecture, after you've understood where the regions or what the regions are, we can list them down into 4 key areas. Now, for me to start with, I'll start with creating a resource. Now, resources form a layer. Now, these resources can be anything. You can name it virtual machines, you can have virtual networks, you can have load balancers, you can consider using firewall, applications, you name it. All sorts of different resources that you can create within Azure environment are part of your resources. Now, these resources must be kept within a resource group in an Azure environment. We'll explore what resource groups are in a bit more detail just in a few moments. Now, your resources and resource groups must belong to a subscription. We'll explore a bit more around what subscriptions are just in a second. And if you're looking to manage one or more subscriptions within your environment, typically these subscriptions are placed within management groups. Now let's start picking one of these at a time and explaining a bit more details around this. For the first, let's talk about what a subscription is. Now, Azure subscriptions are used for you to create resources in Azure environments. This is a method for you to pay for the resources that you consume. So it's a billing process, a billing method that you can pick and choose. Without a subscription, you can't create resources. You might have access to Azure environments, but you're not going to be able to create any resources unless you have a subscription of some sort. We'll cover what different types of subscription you can have just in a moment. However, for example, if you have an account, this is where we could start working within an Azure environment. You may choose to create one or more subscriptions within an account. For example, we have a subscription here called Dev, we have a subscription called Test, and we have a subscription called Production. Now, within a single account, I may have one or many subscriptions, and that's not a constraint. Within each subscription, I can have multiple accounts or users member of that subscription. So it does not have to belong to one user. However, typically you can assign a single subscription to a single user. Otherwise, you could also do this as assigning subscription to an entire department, as in the case of my diagram. You can have a single department like dev department and assign subscription and add all the members of the dev team to be member of the same subscription. Now, as we mentioned, this helps me in understanding the billing boundary of my subscription. So all the resources that get created within this environment will belong to a single subscription. So when I get a bill, typically which is at the end of the month, and is going to show me the charges of the resources that I've consumed, and as long as I've consumed them for, in my one bill at the end of the month. Idea is typically you'll get one bill per subscription. Now, if you need to look at dividing this or understanding some more details around this to know how much did I spend on particular resources, this is something that we can filter further into the bills that we get from the subscription. Now, bearing in mind that we have various methods that we can use as part of my cost management and understand how that looks like in more detail, or dig deeper into my build to understand what resources were consumed. However, if my requirement is that I need multiple builds, then for that, the simple solution I have is to use multiple subscriptions. In this case, if I needed 3 different builds for different departments I'm working with, instead of giving them 1 subscription, the easiest way around will be to give them 3 different subscriptions, which will then simply bring me 3 different builds. Easier for me to manage if I needed to do that. And again, I can add multiple users to be a member of each subscription. Along with that, it also suggests that it makes or creates me a security boundary around my subscription, which simply means that if I have users that are member of 1 subscription, they are capable of gaining access to resources, given them they have the rights and access given to them for all the resources that belong within that subscription. They won't be able to gain access to managing resources that belong to another subscription unless they were given access to that subscription. So it creates a security boundary. Now, apart from just understanding what a subscription is and how you can allocate them, we need to also understand what type of subscriptions do we have. You can get different types of subscriptions. You can start with talking about a free subscription, which is a trial subscription, typically which gives you $200 credit that you can utilize for the first 30 days. Now, if you run out of the $200 credit in day 1, you won't be able to create or use your resources any longer. Or if you elapse the 30 days time period, that subscription runs out. However, you'll still have access to these resources for up to a year. Now, if you want to carry on using these resources, the easiest way around that will be to move away from the free subscription to a paid version, something like pay-as-you-go subscription, typically used by individuals. If you are creating resources and using them for production, then you might be moving on to a monthly payment plan with your pay-as-you-go subscriptions. Like I mentioned, subscriptions typically are billed at the end of the month for the resources that you consume within that time period. Now, if you're not using a resource, you're not going to be charged for having a subscription. Unlike your gym or other memberships that you might have, where you pay at the end of every month, regardless of regardless you attend or you go to the gym. In this case, your subscriptions are not charged just for having a subscription. Now, if you're a small to medium-sized enterprise or a small to medium-sized organization, typically you're going to look at getting subscriptions from a cloud solution provider, which can provide you with different types of subscriptions. A lot of the times, you might be looking for different partners to create solutions for you. As a process, they might need subscriptions to create those solutions, and they hand them over as they pass on the solutions to you. If you're an enterprise level organization, you might already have a committed amount that you are going to spend within the cloud over the year or 2. And based on that requirement, you might already have a requirement of how many subscriptions you need. Or Microsoft can suggest you a number of subscriptions that might be needed for your environment. There is another type of subscription that you can use, which is available for students. Now, this is something that students can utilize to gain access to learning material and try things out in Azure. It gives them a $100 credit for 12 months. They must verify they have a student membership or they're part of an educational organization. Now, once you have a subscription, let's move on to talking about how do we manage if I have 1 or more subscriptions. For you to manage your subscriptions, you can use management groups. By default, you will always have a root management group available for you in your environment. So if you are using subscriptions and not managing them using management groups, they will all be available for you to look at under the management groups. However, for you to manage certain subscriptions for different access or different permissions that you want to set or policies, you won't be able to do that straight away. For you to make that process easier for you as an administrator, you might want to split them in different management groups. Now, in root management group, we can create multiple sub-management groups, and we can number these down as assuming level 1. At level 1, in this particular example, we have human resources and IT and marketing. Now, we can even create further layer within that and call this as level 2, And within level 2, you can see under human resources, I have apps, and it stops at that layer. However, in my IT, at level 2, I have production. But if I look at the production, it goes further down into a third layer. Now the level 3 that we have in production goes into further management groups. Now I can repeat this process as long as I reach level 6, and the management groups won't go any further than that. Now there are some limitations on this, and this is something that we can manage up to 10,000 objects within my subscriptions. And the other limitation is I can only go down up to level 6 if I'm creating sub-management groups within my environment. Typically, you'll see organizations breaking their departments into management groups and then dishing out different subscriptions within each department. You can even have further breaking down of your department into teams, and then those teams maybe into sub-teams, and then dishing out different subscriptions to either individual users or an entire team or sub-team to give you a better management. For instance, if there was a need for me to add any rules or policies, let's for example say I have a new compliance standard that was released for HR, and I wanted to implement some changes onto HR, but I don't want these changes to be implemented on IT or marketing or any other department that I have. All my subscriptions that are under HR, under the sub-management groups, I can simply go and apply a change or rule or a policy right at the HR level in the management group. Anything that is further down, they will automatically inherit any changes that I implement at that level. Makes my life much easier as an administrator to manage my subscriptions. Now, same thing goes around with any other resource that I have. I can simply go and assign a policy to an individual resource if I needed to. However, that might be a lot of work for me. So we're always looking for least administrative effort when we're looking to implement changes. So instead of applying the same policy or same change to multiple policies, it's easier for me to create a management group and then assign those changes to a management group, so it automatically all the subscriptions underneath will inherit that change. Now, mentioning the limitation on management groups, that I can't go more than 6 levels down or creating sub-management groups, or I can't add more than 10,000 objects, these numbers or these details are part of what we refer as your limits and quotas on your subscriptions. Now, for me to look at limitation and quotas, we can have a look at some details either on the web and go into Learn documentation, or we can go into the portal and explore some of these details. Let's have a quick look at it. Now, if I go to the browser and search for Azure subscription limits and quotas, I can see I have a document here available for learn.microsoft.com talking about subscription limits and quotas. Let's have a quick look at this. Now, within this document, if you scroll down, it will have a list of different types of resources that you can create within Azure environment, and giving you the restrictions and limitations of each subscription. Just to highlight, we spoke about just a few moments ago around management groups. This is particularly talking about the limits within a management group, and the numbers I mentioned, around 10,000, are mentioned here. And again, if you're looking to go into creating a hierarchical structure with different levels, you can go up to level 6. That's not including the root management level. So again, there is a lot more detail that you can find within this documentation that talks about limitations and quotas. This document is very long, so if you ever need to know on how many of certain resources can you do or create within a subscription, this document might come handy in terms of understanding where you can find different details in what your constraints or limitations might be. Now let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail in my portal. Right, as we land onto the portal, let's go into the management groups to have a look at the structure first. Currently, I have a root management group, as you can see over here. And as part of that, I have my subscriptions, or my one subscription, the demo subscription, that belongs within the root management group. However, if I look at my further management of my management groups, I can see I have 2 different departments at different level 1. So I have finance, which has sub-level departments underneath. Now, if I look further down, I have IT, and I've broken that further down into dev. I do have IT support, and I can break that even down into further sub-levels. Now let's zoom out a little bit just to kind of see the overall structure of how this looks like. So my overall management group, the root management group, has got now a sub-level IT. Within IT, I have dev or IT support, and IT support has further breaking down into a subcategory of different lines of support that I have, first line, second line, third line. Now this is just to give you an example. Now if I was giving different subscriptions to these, I would be simply allocating subscription in different levels and managing them in that way. Now, apart from that, let's jump into the subscription that I have. Now, within my subscription, let's have a quick look at some details. First of all, what we will do is scroll down to the bottom of the subscription blade and have a look at limits and quotas that we were discussing earlier on. Now, within the blade under the settings, I have usage and quotas. So if I go into usage and quotas, now this is restrictions and limitations that I have based on the subscription that I am working with. My subscription might have different limits and quotas as compared to yours, simply because I'm in a demo environment. Typically, looking at this, you can see different types of resources that you can create within your subscription and how many of those can you work with within an environment. Well, let's, for example, look at the very first thing on my list. I can create up to 100 of these resources in my environment, and currently I have 10 of them already created. Now, what are these? These are some sort of resources called DSV3. These are virtual machine compute that I've chosen to create different virtual machines in my setup. Now, interesting part over here is to look at under the adjustment section. Certain features that I have, I can adjust them. I can request for these limits to be extended. However, there are certain limits that are hard sets. That means I can't change them. However, there's an option for me to request for change, and I can create a support ticket for the backend engineers to look into, seeing if there's anything they can do to cater for any more of those resources for me. Now, if they are able to resolve some of those issues, they might be able to allocate you some more resources. However, that will be your hard limit otherwise on that subscription. Now, if you are having issues to create more resources, or if there's a need for it, you can simply create them under a different subscription, if that works well for your solution. Now, just as a quick overview of some of those resources, if I can go back, I mentioned earlier on with subscriptions that we typically get a bill for a subscription. Under my overview of my subscription, I can get a quick overview of that, currently where I stand in terms of my cost, and how the cost will look like in future as a forecast cost for me currently running my resources in the way that I am using them. Now, if I wanted to go drill down into this a little bit more, I simply will look into the cost analysis that I have here that I can go into. Now, to manage some of this, I might start creating budgets. These might be budgets for different projects, different products, different teams, just to manage that they don't overspend more than what we expect them to in an environment. Or I can simply start creating an alert cost for each one of my resources or projects again. And this is where the system will start generating alerts for me, notifying if I'm coming any closer to my allocated limits. It doesn't actually stop me from going over the limit, but it will start raising alerts, so I'm aware that there are some resources that are consuming more than what they should in terms of cost. Now, as a very quick overview of the cost analysis, this is where I can see the breakdown of the subscription bill that we mentioned earlier on. Here I can see overall cost of my resources as they stand currently, and then I can go into narrowing this down onto different areas that I might want to dig into. For example, service name. This breaks down different services that I'm implementing and how much they're costing me. Location-wise, different regions that I might be implementing my resources in, or if they're based on different resource groups that I might use as my project names to manage my resources. We'll go into resource groups in a moment. Now, I can change some of these filters to pick and choose quite a few other options from in here. Maybe I'm looking for a particular type of resource type, or a particular provider, or particular service, or other metrics that I might want to pick on in terms of the cost to understand what resource is costing me in my environments and how much. So I can filter and change some of this and drill down a bit more into my builds from there. Now, let's take a step back out of the subscriptions. Let's talk about the next layer that we have in our architectural environment or architectural components for my Azure. Let's jump onto the slides. Now, the next layer down from my subscriptions is resource groups. Within my resource groups or within my environment, when I'm creating a resource, these resources must be kept in a resource group, as mentioned before. You can take an analogy of this as a folder on a Windows computer where you manage all your files. Now, someone might say, well, I don't keep my files in a folder, they're on my desktop. And I'll tell you, if you understand the structure of Windows operating system, desktop is a folder somewhere on your environment. So typically your files are in a folder. However, I don't think this is an exact analogy of resource groups. There are some differences that we can look at. Consider this as a container where you will place all your resources. So they're not floating in the cloud anywhere. They are placed in a resource group. Some of the things to highlight, just to ensure that they're not a folder on in your cloud, you can't rename them. So once I create a resource group, I can't go and change the name for it. Now, if I misspelled something or I want to name it something different, the only way around that is creating a new one. Now, creating is not that difficult. We'll have a look at some of that just in a few moments. You can't create a resource group inside of a resource group. So no nesting is allowed in resource groups. Typically, when you create a resource group, you may choose to create a resource group in one or two different ways. You can create a resource group, let's call this resource group 1, in your environment that you could use for an entire project that you're working on. That means a resource group allows you multiple types of resources in a single resource group. In this case, let's assume a web service, so let's assume a virtual machine, and some sort of a storage account that I have available in this resource group. Maybe that's something that I needed for a project that I'm working on, so all the related resources are kept in the same resource group as a project. I could do things differently. I could start creating resource groups. Let's call this resource group 2 and allocate all my web services into one resource group. I could also create another resource group. Let's call this resource group 3 and place all my virtual machines in a resource group 3. And if I want, I can create another resource group in here. Let's call this resource group 4. Place all my storage accounts in my resource group 4. However, this is not something that you will typically see in normal working environments. It's easier for me to manage an example of resource group 1 in an environment. Like I said before, we're looking for ways for least admin effort in our environment. That means if I'm working with the project, let's assume this web project was only available for us to work with for 2 years. Or let's reduce the time. Let's say this was a promotional period. We are creating a web project for about 3 months. Now, after 3 months, I don't require any of these resources. For me to get rid of them, all I can do is go into my Azure portal and delete the resource group. Now, thanks to Azure Resource Manager, ARM manages that for me automatically by deallocating all the resources that were placed within this resource group and deletes them for me. I don't need to manually go and deallocate these resources one by one. As you can imagine, in the second example, if I was spreading them across resource group 2, 3, and 4, I might need to go and pick and choose resources that I'm done with, and I might need to manually delete them one by one. Again, least admin effort, we would probably go with the first example that we have on the screen. Now, my resource group is also placed in a region. So if I'm creating a resource group, typically this resource group would be placed in a region as we mentioned before. Let's assume this resource we create in UK South. Now, resources within this resource group typically would assume they are going into UK South. However, this is not a constraint. You can choose to place these resources in different regions if you needed to. For instance, I'll place this web service in East US, even though it belongs to a resource group that lives in UK South. Now, this might not be an issue for this particular example, so there's something important to understand that when you're creating resources, there are some resources that are dependent on other services to run. In this case, this is not a problem. However, would you want to do that? Maybe you have a particular reason for it. Ideally, I would create my resource groups in a region where I want to place my resources as well. If there's a need for it, the resource groups don't restrict you from doing that. That's all I wanted to demonstrate by adding a resource in here in EastGeoS, even though not something I would recommend unless there was a specific need for it. But the portal doesn't stop you from doing that. Now, apart from creating all of this, you can move resources from one resource group to another, as it mentions on the slide. However, sometimes this process might not be as straightforward as simply click and move, and it might have some other constraints on that, simply because if you're moving resources from one resource group to another, if they are placed in different regions, then there might be some difficulties in doing that. You might simply be able to strip that resource completely down, delete it, and recreate it. Some resources might have simpler requirements for you to move them from one resource group to other. Now, let's have a quick look at resource groups in the cloud. I'm back onto my portal. Now, in here, on my favorite blade on my portal, I can see I have resource groups available here already to look at. So let's jump into that straight away, and let's go into resource groups. Now, for this part of the portal, let's create for this part of the demo, let's create a new resource group to work with. And for this particular session, let's have a quick look at creating a resource group. Now, I'm in the basic tab, and this is the first time we're creating a resource in your Azure portal in this course. So a few things that we need to understand when you're creating a resource. There are some basic resources that we require. Most of the time, these are typically 4 key things that you require to complete. One of them is choosing a subscription where this resource will go into. Second, you're asked to choose a resource group. And third is typically the naming of the resource. And finally, choosing a region. Now, in our case, we're creating a resource group. So creating and naming the resource group becomes the same. So in this case, let's call a resource group. Let's call this AZ104 demo. And we're placing our resources today in this resource group. Now, if I hit next, I have an option over here to create tag. Now you'll see tag for every resource you create. What are tags? This is another way for me to label my resources if I'm looking to filter them down later, either in my billing or if I'm looking at reports to analyze my resources. So I can always look up for them. Now, this is another way for me to filter down my costs and billing. Remember earlier on when we were looking at my subscription bills, I mentioned there are various ways for us to filter through some of the bills. For example, looking at different types of products, looking at different regions, looking at different resource groups. We can also filter our subscription bills based on different tags. Now, every resource can have multiple tags. In this case, I can create my own tags. I can typically look at tags as a key value pair. You create a key and then you provide a value for it. For instance, in this case, I can give it a value, say, department. I've already got one. Let's choose one. Now, this particular resource I'm creating is for my dev team. So I'll give it a value of dev. Now, I can add multiple tags to a single resource as well. So I can say owner. So let's create an owner tag. And in this case, let's give an owner, let's give it IT admin is the owner of this resource. Now, again, I can add other tags like department, tags like teams, tags like projects, tags like cost center, or regions, or whatever that you think is useful for you to remember to filter this information out later, either in your resources or in your builds. I'll leave it as 2 tags for now. Let's hit create and review, and this is my resource group created. Oh, and hit create, obviously. And this is how my resource group gets created. Now let's have a quick look at this. If I hit refresh, and I have my resource group available for me to work with. Now, currently this resource group is empty. We haven't created any resources into it as yet. However, earlier I mentioned that if you're looking to create resources in a resource group, it makes it easier if you place all your resources linked to a project in one resource group, and makes it easier for you to manage them. Now, if I am looking to manage them in that way, what's there to say if someone by mistake deletes a resource group that has all my workload in there, and I get or lose all my data or my resources that are part of it? So deleting them makes it easier for me as an administrator that I can get rid of them in one hit. However, what if that was a mistake and somebody gets rid of my resources? Now, to avoid the deletion in that manner, we can simply go and look at securing some of your resources by adding something called resource locks. Now, for me to add a lock, all I'm looking for is my locks under my resource groups at the moment to apply that onto my resource group. Now, let's have a quick look at adding a lock. Currently, there are no locks applied to this resource group. Let's click on Add and explore the options we have for the locks. Under locks, I have two different options. I have a read-only lock and a delete lock. Two different locks that I can apply. I can give a lock a name. There could be a name that this is applied by an IT admin. You choose a name that you like, or you could define a name on the lock saying what type of lock you're applying or the reason you're applying the lock for. Now, by all means, add descriptions to it. Do not delete this. And we can add this, or maybe something more relevant to why I don't want people to delete this resource group, and add a lock. Now, currently I've added a read-only lock. Now, this doesn't stop me from adding multiple locks. If I'm collaborating with other people within this resource type, I can allow everyone to add a lock onto this, and as and when everyone is done with that particular project, they can remove their lock. Once all the locks are gone, we can delete this. If I've added a lock on this, typically I need to remove the lock before I can go and delete this resource group. Without that, if I try to delete this, it will give me an error saying there's a lock on it, which I need to look into. Now, let's have a quick conversation about some of these details. As we spoke about the core architecture of Azure, we looked at discussing management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups. And at that point, we'll look at just creating resource groups in the previous demo. Now, part of this, I mentioned when you're creating a resource in your environment, you're typically looking at 4 basic details that you're going to be asked. And that's not limited to just these 4, but these are the 4 key areas that you're going to be asked. 1, what subscription you are going to use. Second, you're going to be asked on what resource group you're placing that resource in. Third, you're going to be asked to create a unique name for that resource. Now, typically, this is a unique name for you within your subscription. In some cases, it's globally unique. And the last thing you're going to choose is a region. Where are you going to place this in the globe? Now, along with that, I just mentioned that we can use some locks. There are 2 different types of locks that I just displayed. One of the locks that we looked at was looking at read-only, the one that we just applied. And then we have another lock that calls itself delete lock. Now, the difference between the 2 would be a bit like this. Can I modify resources in my environment? And if I list another item saying, can I delete my resources in my environment? Now, typically, when you apply a read-only lock, you can't modify anything that's within that wherever the lock is applied, and you can't delete the resource either. However, if I was to apply a delete lock, this gives me options to modify this resource or wherever that lock is applied. However, I can't delete that. So in both cases, for my locks, I won't be able to delete the resource. However, with just applying a delete lock, I am still able to carry on working with it and modifying it. But if I apply a read-only lock, that locks it down from anyone from modifying it or deleting that resource. Now, typically, when you're applying your locks, these locks can only be applied at a subscription, resource group, and resource level. So you can't apply your locks onto a management group. And that's something probably important to understand when you're managing your resources in your environment. Now, just before we conclude this part of the module, one thing that's very important to understand is costs. If you're creating your resources, you need to understand that each resource might come at a different cost. Now, for you to look at as an example, you can consider creating a virtual machine and compare that to an app. Now, these are two different resources. They might come at different cost. In fact, if I was to pick up different types of virtual machines, different computes might come at different cost. So it's something that we need to consider as creating resource. So specific cost for a specific resource. Now, that cost may also vary depending on where we place them in different regions. Different regions come at different costs. Now, simply because the running cost for Microsoft for each region might vary. For example, as Brazil South could be more expensive for Microsoft to run as compared to one of the regions in US. So you creating a resource in Brazil South might be more expensive as compared to creating the same resource in one of the other regions in US. Data costs, you might have or you might incur costs on data that's inbound. Most of the time, data ingress for Azure is free of cost in most scenarios. However, data outbound comes at a cost. Typically, this cost is added onto your resources. However, it's still worthwhile looking into details on the outbound cost of your solutions. You can use reserved instances for most resources where you can already choose a resource that you might be working with for a year or 3 years. Based on that, you can get up to 72% discount on creating that resource for a reserved time period. You get an added discount for that. You can also take a benefit of saving cost on licensing. If you already have a license that qualifies for what we refer as Azure Hybrid Benefit on premises, you can use the same license in the cloud and save cost for reusing that license in the cloud. Finally, you can use resources like alerts and budgets as mentioned on the subscription earlier on to limit that cost of your resources or manage the cost of your projects that you're working on. And you can also take advice on Azure Advisor to look at different recommendations on how you can save cost in your environment. Please make sure you visit the recommendations in Azure Advisor. With that, we come to the end of the first part of governance and compliance. I'll see you in the next part.